I think coding should be done kind of in groups in general, especially, Java for me is not a language that I'm super familiar with. Like I can kind of follow it, but it's neat to see the thought process and then what it looks like on paper afterwards. So neat, neat learning
Cool, cool.
experience for me too. So
All right, so we want to, we have a lot going on here on our whiteboard. But the last thing we did was kind of for any single turn, right? If it takes n turns to complete our game, whether we're on turn 1 or turn last, what is it we should do? And we said, oh, this is what we should do. We're going to set our thrust to 3 unless the v speed is greater than 40 in the down direction, then set it to 4. And then we actually converted that to say if v speed is less than -40, then set it to 4. And so now that we kind of put into words what it is we want to do, before we jump into code, and we do have some code that we could go into coding game, we're going to be a little bit more formal and put it into our flowchart. So this is the flowchart that we started way back several videos ago that represents the code as it exists with our sample code.
excellent.
So let's just jump in, because I think there's going to be a lot of things that are the same, right? And that's kind of I think the value of updating the flowchart first. We don't have to worry about syntax or anything like that. Excuse me, we can just start building. So my handy dandy tool, I'm just going to copy and paste. So we start with start, and then I think we're going to initialize our input the exact same way, right? We didn't say anything about changing the way we initialize input.
That's right.
All right, so here's where we get into a little bit of tooling, whether some folks might be using Visio or Lucidchart or Draw.io or any other, or pencil and paper, right? Which is super awesome. I love pencil and paper, actually, might be my favorite. I now need to use the tool to connect these things. So put my arrow in that same way. This if statement or implied if statement, if v speed is less than -40, then set it to 4. Tells me that I'm still going to need this decision structure, right? Do you agree?
I do, yes. And I think part of that came from the project parameters where it said that we want to create an infinite loop, right?
Mm-hmm. So here's where we're going to start making changes. Oh no, I take that back. Just based on what you said, this is our infinite loop part.
Yep.
I should be a more careful listener.
I think you listen quite well.
So we're still going to read inputs for a turn too, right? Still, I like this modification so far. This is right up my alley. No changes.
Yep, yep. My favorite kind of rework as well.
All right, so we get our initial input. So this is our game initializers, right? And then we get into our infinite loop. And then here's where we get, I'm going to reword this actually. Since we use initialize input, I'm going to call this initialize game input, initialize turn input. This feels better to me. What do you think?
So tell me why you wanted to change it. I like the distinction, but why?
So when I look at these now, kind of knowing where we're going to move forward,
Mhm.
these two boxes seem very different to me, and just the way they look on the screen. And yet, when I think about what they're doing, just through our conversation, they're doing some very similar things. So initialize input, and let me back up. They're both true, right? So
Mhm.
the way they're stated here is true, and the way they're stated here is true. So I don't think I'm adding any more truth, but maybe a little bit more clarity. And especially for some folks, if it's like you and me and it's been several days since the last time we looked at this, I think one of the keys to programming is making things super simple, because we're all very busy people. And when it comes to either fixing bugs or updating code, it is quite likely that we haven't looked at this in several days, weeks, or most likely months or years. Right? That's the way it is out at the enterprise. Is you were the coder, you wrote this, but you're being asked to update it a year later. And so if I can make it easier for somebody to catch up to speed, I think that is beneficial. And what was running through my mind is I am setting some initial values for the game here, and then I set some initial values for the turn. And so if that's what I'm doing, right, this is really just some game inputs that are set for the game and never change. And then this other one is some inputs for a turn, right? And those inputs never change, right? For the length of the turn, that's what that input was. Then I'm doing similar things, just kind of at a different level, at a different scope, maybe you might think about it. And so
Perfect.
rewriting it this way, hopefully get somebody else to think that way.
Perfect.
What,
That
what do you
makes it
think?
crystal clear to
Does
me.
it?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep. The documentation piece and the idea of scope, or that, each turn you are setting the parameters for that turn, but then you're not changing any of the game parameters unless it is changed in the turn or for the turn.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
This initializing turn inputs does not change the initialization of game inputs.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
All right, so now we're still want to do some output, but what we said is this is our output right here, right? Setting the thrust is what our output was. We can also set a direction, but we've already said before, we're ignoring direction for episode 1. So it's really deciding what that thrust is going to be set to. And here's
Right.
where so let me make a copy of this. So here we originally said set thrust to 3 unless v speed is greater than 40 in the down direction. And then we clarified that to, and here I'm going to change this just for clarity, not the meaning, but just kind of the pseudocode. If v speed is less than 40, then don't set it, set thrust to 4. Again, just for some clarity, and this helps us identify, oh, this is a decision, right? And so when we come to our flowchart, we can then put in a decision, right? If this is some good pseudocode, I should be able to copy that and just put it here. I can make this a little bit bigger to make it fit within, but this is our decision, right?
Right. So v speed is either going to be greater than or less than -40.
Yeah, so we could have a yes side and a no side. So if v speed is less than 40, then I can. All right, is it okay if I quiz you, Brittany?
Oh, boys, we'll see. Absolutely. Let's go.
So what do you think I ought to write in this box on the yes side?
So v speed is less than -40. Then we would say something to the effect of thrust equals 4.
I agree.
And so following the yes would mean, of course, that v speed is less than -40 is true, and then thrust equals 4.
So what about this side? We didn't write that down here. So we found perhaps a bug in at least in this section. But I do see
Well,
that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that first line in that box.
Ah, yeah.
So we're setting thrust to 3 unless. So we would basically subtract 1 from thrust, right? If the v speed is greater than, or if v speed is not less than -40. And if I'm remembering correctly, thrust can be any value between 0 and 4. So 4 is the max, and then it has to either increase or decrease by increments of 1 per turn.
So it is true that the game will only allow us to increase or decrease by 1, but we can still set a thrust to be whatever we want, right? So if we're at a thrust of 1, we can set it to be 4, but what will happen is the game will only set that to a 2 on the next turn.
That's right. Yep.
So is this what you were saying here? Did I get that right?
Yes. So thrust, let's say at the beginning of the turn is 4, but then V speed it changes and now it's greater than -40, which makes our decision false or no, then we would remove 1 increment from thrust.
So I am so glad that we are doing this together because I wouldn't have thought of that. And my guess is, since you did, there's a lot of other people who did also. And I think this would introduce a bug.
Oh no. I failed the quiz.
No, well, so perhaps the quiz, the 0-point quiz, perhaps you failed. You got a 0 out of 0 instead of a 0 out of 0, I guess. I don't know. But we always want to fail fast, right? So having somebody, if we're pair programming, right, this is some of the super cool things that we can do. And what we said here doesn't align with what we saw here.
Okay. So
And
tell me why.
And I didn't even think about it until, you pointed me back to this line, which I think was the exact right thing to do. But then, when we got to this point, I'm like, oh, I think we skipped a step, or there's some implied steps in here. So let me get rid of this first. Got my Kirby now. We said we want to set thrust to 3.
Yep.
So we could, I think what we would want to do is exactly that. And that would fix all of our problems. And then our thrust would always either be 3 or 4. Whereas what you were saying could introduce some, perhaps some more idealized versions down the road, where we go from, we start at a 0 and then we ramp up to a particular thrust. Here we just say our thrust is going to be 3, wherever we are. Now we're not outputting it. It's just kind of in our brain, in our working space. All right, we're going to be 3, unless, right? And here's our unless. The V speed is less than 40. Then we're going to change it. And so what do we do on the no side? Well, nothing, right? Because that's what we said we would do.
Yep. I see.
How,
I see.
how do you feel about that?
I think that is perfectly clear. And I'm happy that you clarified that for me because I didn't see that at all at first. But yeah. So if we didn't set thrust to 3, thrust could have been 1 at the beginning. Well, what would it have been at the beginning of the turn when we initialized if it wasn't 3?
Oh, and this is right. This is our thrust, right? This is a power that's coming in our game loop.
Yep.
I, as a programmer, probably wouldn't reuse that variable because it's an input value, and wherever I am in the program, I'll want to keep that, right? So I might have power for here and thrust for there, or maybe change this to input power and output power, or input thrust and output thrust. And so I think that's a very good question. Without this here, if we're just looking at that, what would your output thrust be? And it would be undetermined, right? We haven't set a value. So either what ever happens to be in memory at that space, or however your particular language sets a value whenever you instantiate a variable. We don't know. And as programmers, we never want to not know. Not knowing is strictly bad.
Completely fair. Yep.
And so I'd like the way I had written the flowchart, I had introduced a bug early on by not initializing my output thrust. And I didn't realize that until you pointed it out. And so we want to initialize that thrust to 3, just like we said it should be here, right? Set the thrust to
Mhm.
3, unless this. Now, it is possible, there's multiple ways you can get to the same solution, right? Instead of here, I could move that down into my decision and just say the thrust will be 4 if I'm on the yes side, the thrust will be 3 if I'm on the no side. They would be functionally equivalent. And it
Yep.
depends on what you're comfortable with. I would probably refer new programmers to a clean code book. The author's name is escaping me at the moment, but simplifying code, right? So whatever you can make the code be its simplest is probably the more correct version. For me, it is, I will always set the code thrust to 3, and then inside the loop, I will only do one thing, or inside the decision. Loops and
Mhm.
decisions add complexity. So the less I can do inside, the more easy it is to understand. And that is true for me. It may not be true for everybody, but it is true for most.
Excellent. And I just looked it up. I see clean code. Are you referring to the book by Robert Martin?
Bob Martin, sometimes referred to as Uncle Bob. Yes.